because I'm such a big fan of the 6 books that you've released so far about Bowie. So, first question, did you ever interview or meet David Bowie?
Never met him. No.
Are you a fan?
Yeah. I mean, I think my very first memory of watching Top of the Pops as a kid pretty much is when Space Oddity was re-released in 1975, and I think I was not quite 4 years old, but as a kid, it was like watching Playaway or something, you know, it was this guy acting out as being a spaceman, so it kind of really struck me as a kid. So, yeah, I mean, he's always been there, growing up musically, but no, I've never met him.
The whole Bowie kind of thing is quite confusing because, you know, for somebody like myself who came to him with Lift Off with Aisha and then Top of the Pops a few weeks later doing Starman, and then you see the earlier albums being re-released and the Laughing Gnome and everything, and it just seemed like, you know, they're talking about Bowie changing his image. One minute he had curly hair, and the next minute he was a mod, you know, all of these things flying about. But at the age of 4, you do pit me there. I think I was 11 years old when I saw Bowie, but 4 years old, that's unbeatable, I would imagine.
He probably wasn't making records when you were 4, there was he? I'm not being cheeky, but you know what I mean. But...
You are being cheeky. But, I mean, I was lucky enough to meet Bowie on many occasions, and I have to say he had a brilliant sense of humour, really, really off-kilter, big fan of Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and Derek and Clive and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, we'll talk about whether Bowie would have enjoyed your particular oeuvre in a short while, but they are probably my favourite Bowie books of all. And they are the only ones that make me regularly laugh out loud. So the humour in them, was that there from the onset? Did you intend to make it that way, or did it just kind of fall into that place?
For people who've never read them or don't know what the Bowie Odyssey books are like, they're not written using normal music biographies. They're written like fiction, and they're written in the present tense. So they're very much like kind of time capsules of, like almost like stepping out of the TARDIS on the first page, and you're like slap bang there in 1970, 71, 75, whatever. And I really immersed myself in the year with the research, like look at everything. And, you know, I think with a space for humour and jokes, and definitely. But at the same time, you know, I mean, the books are quite kind of, you know, they kind of like run the gamut from humour to some very serious stuff and some very emotional stuff. So it kind of, each one's hopefully a bit of a kind of emotional roller coaster, as the cliche goes.
Somebody described the books to me as being kind of like the Bowie equivalent of the TV series The Crown. Now, just give me a moment on this. And I did watch some of those programmes, but for those who don't know, it follows the royal family. So, for instance, you know all of the kind of key events that happen for the royal family, whether they be the scandals or whether they be some coronation or whatever. But then they have to fill in the parts in between with conversations they would imagine would lead up to that point. And you've done exactly that, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a terribly bad comparison, the Bowie version of The Crown, but it might look like the conversations are quote-unquote made up, but actually even the conversations are based on someone's recollection of the conversation. I definitely dramatise stuff, and I definitely have, you know, I always say, like, I've got a dramatic licence, possibly with speeding points on it, but, you know, I definitely don't kind of, like, just, you know, pull something out of the ether and kind of say, oh, wouldn't it be good if he wore that or did that? They're very much grounded in research and sort of like things that I know that seems to have happened or was someone's account of it or was true.
I know a lot of people who have been involved with Bowie, either in bands with him or mates with him or worked for him, and I've found them to be very, very protective of Bowie and not really wanting to say too much and quite guarded about it, really, particularly, obviously, whilst he was alive. So you did get kind of cooperation from people within.
Yeah, some people, obviously, I make a lot of approaches and a lot don't respond or get knocked back. Because, you know, obviously these books, they're unauthorised. So early days, I did have a few people help me who were really good. And what I found, funnily enough, is that the best people I found talking about Bowie are people who kind of knew him from the very beginning before he got big and kind of always had their own lives anyway, and kind of, you know, are really pleased that, you know, they were part of his life, but don't kind of like feel that they have to dine out the whole time. Was maybe a bit later on as he becomes famous and people come into his orbit then who didn't know him at the beginning, and they're kind of maybe a bit blown away by it or even possibly even quite damaged by it. They're the ones who I think can be a bit thorny, really. But in terms of like the people early days that he knew, I mean, what comes across is just sort of how loyal he was, I think, to his early pals, you know. I mean, if you talk to people like, you know, say John Cambridge, for instance, I think his relationship with Bowie was certainly, you know, like obviously John himself later wrote his own book, but I think that was one of the sort of like most honest and direct one. You know, the fact he drove Bowie up to Hull to get his car serviced, you know, I mean, that's like a lovely story, you know.
Yeah, and he stayed with John's folks, and it was obviously it was John Cambridge who introduced David Bowie to Mick Ronson in the first place. So these people are key, aren't they? So what gave you the idea to choose Bowie as a subject for this particular journey?
Well, the short, long story is that it wasn't my idea. It was Publisher Omnibus. They had the idea for 10 books about Bowie, one book for each year of the 70s, and they were looking for an author mad enough to take it on, and they found me. And there was no brief, really. It was just as loose as that. Can we do 10 books? What do you reckon? So I kind of thought about it and came back to them and said, well, I'll do it if I can write it, and the way I write it, which isn't straight in music biographies, it's, my own sort of a dramatic style. And if you're okay with it being about the year itself as well as Bowie, because that's a really important thing to stress, is that obviously Bowie is the focus of the stories, but there's a lot kind of like going on around him. They're quite sort of widescreen in the kind of the plot they have. I mean, for instance, the latest book on 1975, the central story obviously is Bowie in America, and he's a coke addict, feeding his addiction. He's not doing much, worrying about, witches out to steal his bodily fluids and stuff like that. But at the same time, while he's away in LA, back in England, you've got the beginnings of punk. You have formation of the Sex Pistols. You've got Malcolm McLaren's Sex Shop. There's also a psychopath at large in London who's living just around the corner from where Bowie was raised, and who, much like Bowie himself in 1975, is obsessed with the Nazis and fascism. So there's all these sort of like subplots kind of like maypoling in around each other, sharing common themes. So then I suggested the titles, calling them Bowie Odyssey, and having each book based on the graphic design of the cover of Changes One Bowie, and kind of like came from that, really. So a loose idea was pitched to me, and I thought about it, like how I could kind of adopt it as my own, and pitched it back to them.
Yeah, because those elements that you've just mentioned, and they're quite often dark, there are lots of parallels being drawn. You're drawing a kind of a parallel between David Bowie's mum, Peggy, and Margaret Thatcher, who was just rising to fame. And there's I've just really noticed this looking at it again now, because, being an intellectual, I don't look at pictures in books, but there's a great shot of Bowie there, a still from The Man Who Fell to Earth, I think. And there's also, right opposite, is a photograph of Margaret Thatcher having a hair done, and the haircuts at that point in time are remarkably similar. Now, she won't look like that after she left the hairdressers, but that is just typical of this book, that is just so brilliant, and it made me laugh out loud as well. But all of those elements that you've put, you also have the three Davids in one of the books. Which is Bowie, David Cassidy and David Essex. We're all kind of like, hovering at the same time. But the David Cassidy one is really dark, because obviously it does follow the story of the poor girl who passed away, who was killed at one of his concerts. So I've never known any other book involved in music that particularly figures on one person that features other kind of dynamics from that same era. It's a really, really strange and amazing kind of element to it.
I think the key word really with these books is context, and I think authors who set out to write like a straight biography, if I can use a bit of a artistic analogy, it would be like someone tries to paint a portrait, they kind of absolutely try and capture the soul of the person, whereas I think these books, if they were pictures, they wouldn't be portraits, they'd be like landscapes with figures, and obviously Bowie would be like the most prominent figure in it, but it's as much about what's going on in the background and around him. So obviously in the years like 72, 3, 4, when he really, he becomes like the biggest pop star in Britain by the end of 73 and start of 74. So a lot of the books kind of like almost like a radar tracking where he goes in and out of culture, and you can only really appreciate that when you appreciate like the moments like in 70 when he's not a big star, and even in 75 when in this country, Young Americans, great album that is. I mean, it wasn't a huge success in this country. Obviously in America, Fame got to number one, but nothing compared to how Diamond Dogs and Aladdin Sane had been before it. So I think I think we're looking around, it's really just a sort of really just like pulling back, like and just taking a widescreen view of things, and appreciating them more. In terms of like Essex and Cassidy, I mean, they were the three Davids, and the great thing about that time, you could pick up something like Jackie magazine, and there could be any one of the three of them on like the back page poster at any month.